Okay, imagine you could line up every human who ever lived, every single one, in a single massive row stretching back through time. You're standing at one end, looking down this impossibly long line of people. The person next to you looks pretty familiar. The person 100 spots down looks familiar. 1,000 spots down, still recognizable. But then you keep walking. You keep going back. And at some point, not at the very beginning, but somewhere in the deep middle, you start noticing things that make you do a double take. The skulls are shaped differently. The brow ridges are more pronounced. The bodies are built in ways that seem almost designed for a different planet. And then you go back further still, and you're looking at something that is undeniably human, upright, tool-using, socially complex, thought of, but would absolutely stop traffic if it walked into a grocery store today. And the question that should be burning in your brain right now is, how? How did we get from there to here? How did our ancient relatives end up looking so dramatically different from each other and from us across time and geography? Why wasn't there just one ancient human type that stayed consistent? Why does the fossil record look like someone kept hitting a randomize button on the human character creator for 2 million years? The answer involves geography, isolation, climate, diet, random genetic accidents, and the terrifying, wonderful, chaotic machinery of evolution operating at full speed across timescales that are almost impossible to emotionally comprehend. And once you understand it, once you see how these differences actually happened, you'll never look at a human skull in a museum the same way again. So let's rewind, all the way back to the beginning of the genus Homo, the group that includes modern humans and our closest extinct relatives. The earliest members of Homo appeared in Africa somewhere around 2.5 to 3 million years ago, emerging from a lineage of earlier bipedal primates. These were creatures like Homo habilis, upright, tool-using, with brains notably larger than their predecessors, but still nowhere near the size of a modern human brain. They were small, they were scrappy, and they were operating in a world that was actively trying to kill them in about 40 different ways simultaneously. Now here's the foundational principle that explains everything that follows. Evolution does not produce identical outcomes in different environments. It produces locally optimized outcomes. And Africa, even just Africa, is not one environment. It is dozens. It is savannas and rainforests and deserts and highlands and coastlines and river valleys, each with different temperatures, different food sources, different predators, different disease pressures, different UV intensities, different seasonal patterns. Even before humans left Africa, the continent was large enough and varied enough to begin pulling populations in different directions, physiologically and anatomically. But then Homo erectus showed up and changed everything. Homo erectus, appearing around 1.9 million years ago, was the first member of our genus to leave Africa in significant numbers and spread across Eurasia. And this is where the story of human diversity really accelerates, because the moment you take a population that evolved in one environment and move it into radically different ones, you've pulled the trigger on an evolutionary process that will operate independently in each new location for potentially hundreds of thousands of years. Homo erectus spread east into South and East Asia, encountering environments completely unlike African savannas. Dense forests, different prey animals, different plant foods, different climates, different parasites, different seasonal patterns, different everything. The populations that settled in different regions began adapting to their local conditions, and because the distances involved were enormous and population sizes were small, these groups became increasingly isolated from each other. Isolated populations are evolution's favorite playground, because isolation means the genetic changes that occur in one group don't flow into another group and get diluted. They accumulate, they stack up. And over tens of thousands of generations, they produce populations that look and function meaningfully differently from each other. Meanwhile, back in Africa, the lineage kept evolving too. Different African populations in different environments continued diverging in their own directions. And separately in Europe, a cold, resource-scarce, heavily glaciated environment was shaping its own human lineage in its own direction. The lineage that would eventually produce the Neanderthals. Now, let's spend some time with Neanderthals specifically, because they are the most famous example of ancient human difference and the most commonly misunderstood. For most of the 20th century, the popular image of Neanderthals was essentially a thick-skulled, hunched-over, grunting brute, prehistoric humanity's embarrassing earlier draft. That image is wrong in almost every detail, but it persists because it's satisfying to imagine our ancestors as obviously superior to the competition. The reality is that Neanderthals were a highly sophisticated human population that lived in Europe and Western Asia for somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 years, far longer than anatomically modern humans have existed in our current form. They made complex tools. They buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods. goods. They used pigments, possibly for body decoration. They controlled fire, constructed shelters, hunted large game cooperatively, and cared for injured and elderly members of their communities, individuals who could not have survived without assistance, which means Neanderthals were practicing a form of social compassion that has clear behavioral complexity behind it. But they looked strikingly different from modern humans. And understanding why requires understanding what Europe was like during the time they evolved there. Europe during the Pleistocene era, the Great Age of Ice, was a brutal, cold, resource-limited environment. The glaciers advanced and retreated in cycles, reshaping landscapes, eliminating or creating habitats, forcing populations into refugia during cold periods, and then expanding them during warmer intervals. The animals Neanderthals hunted were massive: woolly mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer. Close-range hunting of animals this size, with the spear technology available at the time, was extraordinarily physically demanding and extremely dangerous. So what did evolution do with a population living in cold climates and hunting enormous dangerous animals at close range for hundreds of thousands of years? It built them for exactly that job. Neanderthal bodies were stocky and powerfully muscular, a body shape that retains heat more efficiently in cold climates, the same principle that explains why people of Arctic ancestry today tend towards shorter, more compact builds compared to populations from hot climates, where tall and lean bodies dissipate heat more effectively. Their bones were dramatically thicker and denser than ours, suggesting muscle attachment points for a level of physical strength that modern humans simply don't match. Studies of Neanderthal skeletons show injury patterns remarkably similar to those of rodeo riders, the kind of trauma that results from close, physical, high-stakes encounters with very large animals. Their skulls looked different for reasons that were functional, not arbitrary. The large brow ridges that make Neanderthal skulls so distinctive served as structural reinforcement, a buttress above the eye sockets that handled the biomechanical stress from heavily muscled jaw and neck muscles. Their mid-faces projected forward in a shape that may have been an adaptation for pre-warming extremely cold air before it reached their lungs, essentially a built-in respiratory heater for Arctic-level temperatures. Their brains were, on average, actually slightly larger than those of modern humans, though shaped differently, with more of the volume in the back of the skull dedicated to visual and spatial processing, and proportionally less in the frontal regions associated with certain types of social cognition. Every single one of these differences makes sense when you understand the environment that produced them. Neanderthals weren't a failed prototype. They were a highly optimized solution to the specific problem of surviving in glacial Europe as a large game hunter. The differences between them and us aren't random. They're the accumulated product of hundreds of thousands of years of selection pressure operating in a specific direction, in a specific place, on a specific population that was isolated enough from other human groups to maintain its own evolutionary trajectory. Now shift your attention to the other end of Eurasia, to what is now Indonesia and the surrounding island chain, and you find something entirely different. Homo floresiensis, discovered in 2003 on the island of Flores, represents one of the most astonishing examples of human diversity ever uncovered. These were humans, members of our genus, who stood roughly 1 meter tall, about 3 feet 4 inches. They had brains roughly the size of a grapefruit, and yet they made tools, hunted cooperatively, and managed to survive on their island for hundreds of thousands of years. The explanation for their tiny size is a well-documented evolutionary phenomenon called island dwarfism. When large animals become isolated on islands, they frequently evolve towards smaller body sizes over generations because islands have limited food resources and smaller bodies require less energy to maintain. The metabolic pressure of keeping a large body alive simply isn't worth it when calories are scarce and predators may be limited. The same phenomenon produced dwarf elephants and dwarf hippos on various Mediterranean islands. Homo floresiensis appears to be what happens when you apply this principle to a human lineage isolated on a resource-limited island for an extended period. Think about that for a moment. The same species-level group that produced the massive, powerfully built Neanderthals also produced in an entirely different environment with entirely different pressures, a tiny 1 meter tall human with a grapefruit-sized brain. Same genus, radically different outcomes, because the environments were radically different. Then there are the Denisovans, perhaps the most mysterious ancient human group of all, because we know them almost entirely from DNA rather than complete skeletons. The Denisovans were identified in 2010 from a fingerbone fragment found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, and subsequent genetic analysis revealed they were a distinct human lineage that split from the Neanderthal lineage somewhere around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. What did they look like? We're not entirely sure. The physical remains are fragmentary, but their DNA has survived in the genomes of modern humans across a huge swath of Asia and the Pacific. Modern Tibetan populations carry a Denisovan-derived variant of a gene called EPAS1 that dramatically improves oxygen efficiency at high altitude. This variant is essentially what allows Tibetans to live and thrive at elevations that would incapacitate or kill most people. Their hemoglobin regulation at altitude is physiologically different from lowland human populations in a way that is directly traceable to interbreeding with Denisovans. Aboriginal Australians and Melanesian populations carry among the highest proportions of Denisovan ancestry of any living people, reflecting a long-ago mixing event during the migration into the Pacific. Indigenous populations across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands carry Denisovan gene variants that appear to have provided adaptive advantages in those environments. The Denisovans apparently ranged across an enormous geographic area, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and in doing so, adapted to an enormous range of environments, developing genetic variants that proved useful to the modern humans who later moved through those same territories and interbred with them. The Denisovans are, in a very real sense, still with us, embedded in the DNA of billions of living people. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. And this brings up the most important and often overlooked dimension of why ancient humans were so different from each other. They weren't entirely separate. They overlapped. They encountered each other. And, as the genetic evidence now makes absolutely clear, they interbred repeatedly in multiple locations across multiple time periods. Modern humans of non-African ancestry carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, the legacy of interbreeding events that occurred as modern humans moved out of Africa and through the Middle East and Europe. Modern Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations carry additional Denisovan DNA on top of that. Some populations in sub-Saharan Africa carry genetic signatures suggesting introgression from archaic African lineages we haven't even fully identified yet. Ghost populations whose DNA shows up in living people, but whose physical remains we haven't definitively located in the fossil record. This completely dismantles the old textbook model of human evolution, which imagined a single linear progression from primitive to advanced, with each stage replacing the previous one cleanly. The actual picture is more like a braided river. Multiple lineages flowing forward through time, separating and rejoining, contributing genetic material to each other at points of contact, influencing each other's biology in ways that persisted long after the specific population went extinct. The differences between ancient humans weren't fixed and permanent. They were permeable, constantly being shuffled at the margins through interbreeding events that left genetic fingerprints we're still reading today. Now, overlay onto all of this the role of random genetic drift, and the story gains another dimension of complexity. In small, isolated populations, which is what most ancient human groups were for most of human prehistory, random chance plays a disproportionately large role in which genetic variants become common. If a small founding population of, say, a few hundred individuals moves into a new territory, the genetic diversity of that entire lineage going forward is constrained by whatever happened to be in the genomes of those few hundred people. This is called the founder effect. Characteristics that were rare or common purely by chance in that founding group become the baseline for all their descendants. Over generations, if the group remains isolated, those characteristics become entrenched, not because selection drove them there, but because chance planted them there to begin with. This is why some human populations have high frequencies of certain traits that appear almost nowhere else. Certain eye shapes, certain ear formations, certain blood type distributions, certain metabolic patterns. Some of these track selection pressure from the environment, but some of them are the residue of founder effects in populations that expanded from small groups in relative isolation. Ancient humans were constantly moving into new territories with small founding populations, and then experiencing the amplification of whatever genetic peculiarities their founders happened to carry. Climate deserves its own extended consideration here, because across the timescales we're discussing, climate didn't stay still. The Pleistocene epoch, which spans most of the period when ancient humans were diversifying, was characterized by cycles of glaciation that repeatedly reshaped habitable zones on every continent. During glacial maxima, ice sheets advanced southward across Europe and North America. Sea levels dropped dramatically as water was locked in ice, and massive areas of currently habitable land became uninhabitable. Populations were pushed into refugia, isolated pockets of survivable habitat, where they survived in small numbers, sometimes for tens of thousands of years before expanding again during warmer interglacial periods. These glacial cycles were evolutionary accelerators. Populations pushed into refugia experienced intense selection pressure from the harsh conditions, and their small sizes amplified the effects of both selection and drift. When conditions improved and populations expanded again, they carried the accumulated genetic changes from their refugia period out into the broader landscape. This cycle, isolation, intensified selection, re-expansion, repeated multiple times across the Pleistocene, each cycle ratcheting up the differences between populations that had been isolated in different refugia. It also repeatedly created opportunities for previously separated populations to meet again, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes competing, sometimes one population absorbing another. The complexity of the genetic and fossil record reflects this extraordinary, churning, never stable pattern of divergence and reconnection playing out over millions of years. Food is another underappreciated driver of ancient human diversity. Different environments offered completely different dietary resources, and the human body adapted, over generations, to the specific nutritional landscape of each environment. Populations that relied heavily on starchy plant foods developed higher copies of a gene called AMY1, which produces amylase, an enzyme that breaks down starch in the mouth. More amylase means more efficient starch digestion. This adaptation is found at higher frequencies in populations with historically starch-heavy diets and lower frequencies in populations that relied more on meat and fat. You can literally read dietary history in the human genome. Similarly, the ability to digest lactose, milk sugar, in adulthood is not universal in ancient or modern humans. The ancestral condition for all mammals, including humans, is lactase persistence only in infancy. As adults, most ancient humans would have lost the ability to efficiently digest fresh milk. But in populations where cattle herding became economically central, in parts of Africa and in northern Europe, a genetic mutation enabling continued lactase production in adulthood spread rapidly, because being able to exploit the caloric and nutritional value of fresh milk conferred a significant survival advantage. This mutation spread independently in different herding populations, through different genetic variants, because the same dietary environment, pastoral herding, created the same selection pressure in different places simultaneously. Every population of ancient humans, adapting to its local food environment, accumulated these kinds of metabolic and digestive differences over generations. They weren't visible from the outside necessarily, but they were real, they were significant, and they represent another layer of genuine biological difference, built up through the same evolutionary machinery that shaped skull shapes and body sizes. What emerges from all of this, the geography, the climate, the diet, the isolation, the founder effects, the interbreeding events, the glacial cycles, is a picture of ancient humanity that is almost unimaginably diverse, not just in appearance, but in physiology, metabolism, disease resistance, altitude tolerance, cold tolerance, dietary efficiency, and probably cognitive styles shaped by different social environments. The Neanderthals who hunted mammoths in glacial Europe were not the same kind of human as the Homo floresiensis individuals who hunted pygmy elephants on a tropical island, who were not the same kind of human as the Denisovans ranging across the Siberian steppes, who were not the same kind of human as the early modern humans developing symbolic art and complex social networks in southern Africa. Same genus, same deep evolutionary heritage, radically different expressions, all because evolution is fundamentally local, fundamentally responsive to environment, and fundamentally without any central plan or unified direction. And this is the part that should probably make you feel something profound about what it means to be human. Modern Homo sapiens, all 8 billion of us, are what happened after this extraordinary proliferation of human diversity eventually narrowed down. We are the one branch that spread and survived while the others faded. But we carry traces of the others in our DNA. We walk around with Neanderthal immune genes helping us fight viruses, with Denisovan altitude adaptations in Tibetan lungs, with ancient African archaic variants embedded in sub-Saharan genomes. The diversity didn't disappear, it got folded into us, layer by layer, interbreeding event by interbreeding event, until what emerged was a species that is simultaneously more uniform than what came before, and secretly more complex than it appears on the surface. The ancient humans were different from each other because every environment on Earth made different demands, and life, relentlessly, brilliantly, without mercy, answered those demands with whatever biological solutions it could engineer in the time available. The result was a planet full of human experiments, each running its own variation on the theme of intelligence and survival, each shaped by where it was standing and what it was eating and how cold its winters were. We are the descendant of all of them, the sum of 2 million years of those experiments, walking around in bodies shaped by geography and chance and time, carrying ancient fingerprints in our genes from people whose names we will never know, and whose faces we can only partially reconstruct from fragments of bone pulled out of the earth. That might be the most remarkable thing about being human. Not that we're here, but how many different versions of us had to exist first, and how many of those versions are still quietly inside us.